Today we're going to be hearing from our own Dr. Trip Glazer, who is in the midst of producing a book manuscript entitled Darwin's Philosophy of Emotion. So today he's going to present some ideas and material from that book manuscript, and his talk is also titled Darwin's Philosophy of Emotion. So he'll do his talk, and then we'll have some time for Q&A. Sure.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you all for coming. I'm so excited to share my work with you all. All right, so toward the end of his life, Charles Darwin published this incredible book, The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals. And in this book, he presents a detailed, systematic theory of the bodily expression of emotion. But the question I'm going to be investigating today is whether he also gives a theory of emotion. So yes, he talks about facial expressions, gestures, vocalizations, but does he also talk about the subjective psychological states that those behaviors express? So yes, we've got a theory of behavior, but do we also have a theory of feeling? The consensus view among scholars is that no, Darwin does not have a theory of emotion. This is a philosopher of emotion, John Dee, who writes, Darwin himself was unconcerned with the question of the nature of emotions. He was chiefly concerned with involuntary expressions of emotion. Here's a historian, Thomas Dixon, who writes, Darwin did not have any theory of emotions. He never tried to explain the origin or functions of emotional feelings, nor did he try to define or classify the emotions per se. Here are two psychologists of emotion, Maria Gendron and Lisa Feldman Barrett. They say Darwin never intended to craft a model of emotion. So my incredibly ambitious goal is to prove all of these smart people wrong, right? To argue that in fact Darwin did have a theory of emotion. I think that I'm in a position to do it because while many scholars have looked at Charles Darwin's scientific influences, so the geologists, the biologists that he was reading about, considerably less attention has been paid to his philosophical influences, so the philosophers that he was reading and engaging with. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you through a journey of Darwin's philosophical influences. So to start, I'm going to tell you about this philosopher, David Hartley. Hartley is hardly read today, which is unfortunate, because his book, Observations on Man from 1749, is incredibly interesting and ambitious. It's a theory of the mind with a really great focus on emotion. So Hartley presents a theory of emotion that can be summed up with these three labels: empiricism, associationism, and materialism. So as an empiricist, Hartley says that there are no innate ideas. The mind begins a blank slate, tabula rasa. So we have to learn everything. You're born with no ideas, no innate mental structures. And so Hartley applies this to the emotions by saying that we have to learn the emotions. A child must learn to fear, hope, and grieve. We are not born with that disposition within us. Associationism was an approach in philosophical psychology that dominated the 19th century in both England and France. And this was an attempt to do psychology by reducing all mental activity to the process of association. So the principles of association to describe mentality. And so the associationist would say that sensation, so if you see something, if you hear something, if you smell something, this is going to set in motion strings of association, which are called trains of thought. Right? So if I say the word salt, you think pepper. Thank you, Audrey. Right? So that's an association. You hear something, and something pops into your head. And we can give an analysis of how it's associated. Another example, so if you'll have seen The Office, there was an episode where Jim is impersonating Dwight. You'll know this episode, right? And so he asks Dwight, which bear is best, because that's the sort of thing Dwight was interested in. And then Jim says, bears beats Battlestar Galactica, which is just a string of associations, things that he associates with Dwight that start with the letter B. So the associationists thought that we can actually analyze all thinking in terms of these trains of associations, how one idea and then the next kind of jumps into our heads. So John Stuart Mill had this whole theory of logic where if we learn the right associations, we naturally reason in the right way. Our mind is just sort of guided to the right conclusion. The way that Hartley applies this to emotion is he says that the emotions are in fact trains of pleasurable or painful associations. So you're walking down the street, let's say we're walking together down the street and we see a stray dog. Because each of us has had different experiences with dogs, we are going to have different associations about this dog. I am going to be reminded of that dog that bit me when I was a kid. I'm going to vividly remember how much it hurt. I'm going to imagine this dog biting me. I'm going to want to turn and run away. That train of painful associations is, according to Hartley, fear. So fear is not like a feeling, singular. It is a train of feelings, plural, and they are linked by the principles of association. You see the same dog, but that reminds you of your fuzzy friend at home, how much pleasure you get from having your face licked, so you want to go up and approach the dog. So this is a kind of reductivistic theory. These things we call emotions are not special. They're actually just trains of associations. They're thoughts and feelings that have been sort of brought together by these psychological processes. Finally, as a materialist, Hartley believes that mental states just are physical states, so he doesn't believe that there's a fundamental distinction between mind and body. Everything is physical. And the way that he applies this to emotion is he says that expressions are actually parts of the emotions. So fear is not just the associated feelings, fear is also the associated actions. So we form these associations, so when you're afraid, the hair, on the back of your neck stands up, your heart rate increases, right? And so the same principles that connect feelings connect actions to that train. So an emotion is a train of thoughts, feelings, and actions guided by past experience. That's the theory. The next person in my story is Joseph Priestley. Anyone know what important discovery Priestley made in chemistry?
Nitrous oxide.
Is that true?
That's true.
Oh, okay, I didn't know.
And dephlogisticated air.
Yes, that's what I was thinking, which is
Oxygen.
Oxygen, right? So he did these experiments, he isolated what he called dephlogisticated air, which turned out to be oxygen. Priestley was really a polymath. He was also a philosopher, and so he wrote that his second favorite book after the Bible was Hartley's Observations on Man. And he actually published a really popular abridgment of Hartley's book in 1775. So this is more than a decade after Hartley had died. So Hartley's book is really long, it's really complicated, it's really hard. Not a lot of people read it or liked it. But Priestley was a Hartley stan, and so he made a slimmed down, accessible, more plausible version of the book, which introduced Hartley to a new generation of thinkers. At this time, Priestley was a member of the Lunar Society of Birmingham. This was a kind of scholarly social club. They called themselves the Lunatics. They would only meet on the full moon. But does anyone want to guess who founded this society?
Pain.
Good guess, but wrong.
Darwin.
Which Darwin?
No idea.
Erasmus.
Erasmus Darwin, so Charles Darwin's grandfather. Let me tell y'all one more story, I can't help it. So Priestley had a nickname in the press, which was Gunpowder Joe, which is like the most badass nickname ever. And the reason he was called, so the newspapers would write that every one of Priestley's words was a grain of gunpowder, and his critics were holding a match. And so in addition to being a chemist and a philosopher, he was also a prominent Unitarian theologian. So Unitarianism is a form of Christianity that is non-Trinitarian. So Unitarians reject the Trinity, they reject the divinity of Christ, and they reject the doctrine of original sin. And so he would publish these kind of inflammatory defenses of Unitarianism against Trinitarian Christianity. And so actually one day a mob of religious zealots came to his house to kill him. Thankfully he wasn't there, and so they burned his house down while chanting, "No more philosophers." Right? And that's why I don't share my address with my students. I feel like silently lead the charge. Right? And Audrey's band would be like playing music while my house is burning down. No more philosophers. So Priestley ran to his friend Erasmus Darwin, who helped him relocate to Pennsylvania. This all happened before Charles was born, but Charles was raised hearing the story of Uncle Joe having his house burned down for offending religious zealots. And so many biographers think this partly explains Darwin's reluctance to publish his theory of evolution by natural selection. He experienced extreme anxiety about it. Whenever his work was presented to the Royal Society, he was like too sick to attend, and his symptoms are sort of consistent with a kind of anxiety disorder. And so it seems probable that having grown up with these stories of if you offend religious people, they'll burn your house down, made him really, really scared of publishing his ideas. But anyway, so Erasmus Darwin, who was incredibly famous in his day, although less remembered today, wrote this book called the Zoonomia, which is Greek for the laws of life. The word biology had not yet been invented. It was invented a few years later in French by Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. But I think if the word biology had been around, he would have called it biology, because it's basically a textbook of biology and psychology. Today, people remember the Zoonomia because it includes an early formulation of evolution. So he writes, would it be too bold to imagine that all warm-blooded animals have arisen from one living filament? He did not identify the mechanism of evolution, natural selection, that's Charles's honor, but Erasmus Darwin did believe in evolution. He thought that all species originated from a single organism. He just didn't really know how it worked. Erasmus Darwin wrote scientific poetry. And his scientific poetry, although it was really popular, it was kind of quaint, it was kind of old-fashioned and conventional. And so the publication of his Botanic Garden influenced one of the most famous works of poetry ever. You know which one?
No, really.
I know, this is so unfair to ask these trivia
Completely
questions.
unfair. Walt Whitman's Leaf of Grass.
Oh, great guess, but not quite. So lyrical ballads by Wordsworth and Coleridge.
Oh, yeah.
And so actually, so both of them were really, they liked Erasmus Darwin's scientific work, but they didn't like his sort of materialistic worldview. They had more sort of romantic worldview. And so Wordsworth's poem about Tintern Abbey includes reference to glad animal movements, which is an Erasmusian idea. And so he was hugely important. So actually, long before Charles came around, people were described as Darwinians, right? Because they followed Erasmus Darwin's theory. I care about him, well, for lots of reasons. But the reason here is that he defends Hartley's theory of emotion, the one I sketched out earlier. And he actually takes it a step further by trying to give specific accounts of how certain expressions get tied to certain feelings. And so I'm going to tell you about that theory. It's not a great theory, I'll tell you in advance, but I think it's interesting. So the basic idea is that if a person performs an action while having a feeling, then an association may form in their heads, such that the action may become an involuntary expression of that feeling. So here's an example. You're walking in the woods, you hear a rustling of leaves. You feel uneasy, your mind begins racing between thoughts of danger and pain. You voluntarily, so you're consciously, deliberately doing this, you stop and you hold your breath to listen, to find the source of the sounds. Erasmus Darwin says that as a result, an association is going to form in your head, just like between salt and pepper, but in this case between uneasiness and holding your breath. And so he says the next time you feel uneasy, you're going to involuntarily, automatically stop and hold your breath because of this association. Again, I don't think it's a great theory. I don't think that's probably what actually happens. But you can sort of see how the idea works and how it's an early attempt to give a psychological, mechanical explanation of behavior. Right, so in Erasmus Darwin's analysis, an expression is a habit. And it's based on experience, it's based on association. It's learned. Looking forward, so Charles Darwin, in his book, Expression of the Emotions of Man and Animals, he has 3 principles that form the heart, the core of the work, and actually this is the first one. So the first principle he just takes directly from his grandfather, Erasmus Darwin. So as I said, expressions, they're not innate, they're learned, but Erasmus argues that some expressions are learned in the traumatic moment of birth itself. You're going to like this learning. This is really interesting. Again, I'm sure the explanation is wrong, But I like the way Erasmus is thinking, the way he tries to figure it out. So here's a long quote. He says, as soon as the young animal is born, the first important sensations that occur to him are occasioned by the want of respiration and by his sudden transition from 98 degrees of heat into so cold a climate, he trembles and begins to breathe with frequent and short respirations. The cold contracts his red skin, gradually turning it pale. This early association of motions and sensations persists throughout life. The passion of fear produces a cold and pale skin with tremblings, quick respiration, and this constitutes the natural or universal language of this passion. So the trauma of birth fixes many of our expressions. Again, probably not right, but it's really cool, right? I mean, can you imagine having this thought and writing it down? I can't. Erasmus had another principle, which is that opposite feelings have opposite expressions. And again, I think he gives a kind of interesting, if false, analysis. So he says, babies pucker their lips when they're unhappy. Once they become happy, their lips move in the opposite manner, forming a smile. As a result, an association forms, and even adults smile when happy. So it's a result of nursing. And so again, looking forward, Charles, as I said, has three principles of expression. Here's the second one. So his first two principles of expression are taken word for word from his grandfather. Okay, so this brings us to Chuck. I'm going to be really focusing on this short but incredibly formative period of his life between 1837 and 1840. So he was born in 1809. He traveled the world on the Beagle between 1831 and 1836. Right after getting back, he has all this ambition to become a famous scientist. And in fact, he had all of his good ideas right then, and he spent the rest of his life working out the details and publishing them. So in this period, he filled 4 notebooks with thoughts about evolution. And so he actually discovered natural selection right at the end of notebook notebook C, 1838. And then he's developing the theory of natural selection in D and E. Here's another trivia question for you all. What do you think he titled his first notebook on evolution? So he gets back from the Beagle, he wants to create a theory of evolution, he opens up a notebook and he writes a title at the top of it. What do you think his title is?
Galapagos Islands.
What?
Galapagos?
Oh, I love that. No. Zoonomia. Right? So his grandfather's book about evolution, Zoonomia, Charles Darwin's first notebook about evolution, Zoonomia. Isn't that cool? Isn't that cool? At the time that he's developing this early theory of evolution, he fills 2 notebooks, and there's assorted other notes on emotion and expression. He calls these his metaphysical inquiries, his philosophical inquiries. Right? And so just as he got all of his materials for his theory of evolution, he waited a long time to publish them. He formulated his theory of expression in this early period and waited even longer to publish them. Right? So the story of Charles Darwin's life is he had a bunch of ideas after getting back from the Beagle, and he spent decades and decades and decades looking for more evidence, putting off publication because he had so much anxiety about it, and then eventually being sort of pushed by others, external circumstances to publish his ideas. So 1838, Charles is studying his grandfather's theory of emotional expression. We know this because he's paraphrasing it, sort of page by page, in this first notebook on expression. And these notes, as I said, form the basis of expression. So you can actually sort of trace the path of ideas from Erasmus Darwin's book to Charles Darwin's early private notebooks to his eventual publication. So I'll just give you one example to give you a flavor of it. So this is what Erasmus wrote in 1794. When we hear any the smallest sound that we cannot immediately account for, our fears are alarmed, we suspend our steps, hold every muscle still, open our mouths a little, erect our ears, and listen to gain further information. This is how Charles sums it up in 1838. He writes, fear is connected with the habitual stopping of breath to hear any sound, and this is how he puts it in his published work a few decades later. The diversified expressions of fear may be accounted for through the principles of habit, association, to hear distinctly whatever sound may reach our ears. Right? So I know I'm making it sound like he just kind of plagiarized his grandfather, and so he does accept a lot of what his grandfather says, but he adds a unique evolutionary twist. Right? So Erasmus, as I mentioned earlier, was an empiricist. He thought there are no innate ideas, and so he believed that expressions arise from our own experiences, in particular that traumatic moment of birth. So he said that expressions are habits. Charles comes in and he proposes that perhaps our expressions arise not from our experiences, but from our ancestors' experiences. So he proposes here that expressions are inherited habits which become instincts. I put a little asterisk there because if you know much about evolutionary theory, you're going to say this is like Lamarckianism, this isn't really Darwinian natural selection. But throughout his life, Charles Darwin believed that inherited traits like habits can be inherited and passed down. It was only much, much later that sort of natural theory was understood as a competing theory to exclude the inheritance of acquired characteristics. Right, so just kind of summing this up, if you take Erasmus's theory of expression and you combine it with Charles's theory of evolution, you get Charles's theory of expression. So just combining those ideas. So I know I've been talking a lot about expression. I haven't said anything about emotion, so that's where we're going to go now. So in 1839, this is the next year, Mackintosh called Dissertation on the Progress of Ethical Philosophy, which was actually published for the Encyclopedia Britannica. It's a bunch of summaries of philosophers' views with a focus on moral psychology, so theories of emotion. Charles actually knew this guy Mackintosh. Mackintosh married his wife's aunt. Mackintosh was a good deal older. When Charles Darwin was a college student, he would go to the pub when Mackintosh was giving philosophy lectures. And in his autobiography many years later, Darwin says that Mackintosh was the greatest conversationalist on grave topics, so philosophy. Right? So I mean, can you imagine like if I went to Tim's and gave like philosophy lectures? I feel like people would definitely burn my house down, right? But apparently that's what this guy did. So Darwin, he reads these summaries of philosophical views, and he reads the summary of Hartley's view. And Darwin just falls in love with Hartley. And so throughout this time, if we look at Darwin's notes, we have comments like this. I think there is much truth in Hartley's doctrine. Does not Hartley's explanation apply perfectly? Yes, Hartley explains this. And this is really uncharacteristic for Charles, who tended to be very critical, very kind of skeptical. He would say, so-and-so says, but I'm not so sure about it. But with Hartley, he's like, yes, this is awesome. I love it. Right, so just as his grandfather was a Hartley stan, he is a Hartley stan too. All right? Why was Charles so taken by Hartley's theory? I think the reason is that Hartley's theory implies that minds differ only in degree. So the difference between a human mind and an ape mind and a dog mind and so on is just the power of association, our ability to make these connections. Charles's final book was about worms. He did all of these experiments on worms. He found that worms can't really see anything. They can't really hear anything. They have very limited feeling of touch, so like they don't seem to notice heat or cold. And this made Charles wonder whether the reason why humans are smarter than worms is we just get a lot more information about our environments. Because even though worms get very little information, they're quite intelligent, they can problem solve. And so he didn't really develop that thought, but he had this idea that maybe worms are like smarter than us, but they have so little information that they just can't do much with it. In the same way that like ChatGPT is not really intelligent, but because it has access to so much information, it can produce really incredible results.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
If Hartley is a materialist, he doesn't believe in minds. Does he use the word mind?
Yeah, so he believes in minds, but he thinks they're physical.
Oh, okay, but he does use the word mind.
Yeah, for sure, yeah.
Okay.
And so he says that associations are nerve vibrations. And so we can talk in the register of mental states, but they're ultimately to be explained in terms of physical states. Yeah. So Darwin reads Hartley, he's all about it. And so then he goes on reading these other theories of emotion, and he's criticizing them, and he's reaffirming Hartley's theory. So for example, as I mentioned, Hartley says that emotions are trains of thought, they're strings of associations. Darwin next reads a summary of Dugald Stewart, some random philosopher, who says that emotions are original feelings. He says they can initiate strings of associations, but they are not themselves associations. And so in Darwin's copy of Macintosh's dissertation, we find this note scrawled at the bottom. He says, yet emotions are results. They are trains of thought long associated with action. So in other words, he's saying, you're wrong, you're right. Right? That's the theory that applies. Another example, Hartley says that expressions are parts of emotions. Macintosh, who presents his own view, of course, in this encyclopedia, says that emotions are rather simple feelings that are distinct from their bodily expression. This is Darwin's response in his notebook. He says, rather, ideas and bodily actions make the emotion. And then, and this is maybe Charles at his most philosophical, he reasons through a logical consequence of that view. So if expressions are parts of emotions, then it seems to follow that emotions don't cause expressions. Right? Because you kind of need to have the expression for it to be an emotion. And so this is how Darwin puzzles through it. He says, but what first caused this bodily action if the emotion was not first felt? Without abrupt flush, acceleration of pulse, or rigidity of muscles, man cannot said to be angry. He may have pain or pleasure. These are sensations, but they are not yet the emotion. So in other words, he's saying, yes, emotional feelings cause emotional expressions, but this is just talking about two different sides of the same train of associations. Right? The feelings are the locomotive, the expressions are the caboose. But it's the train that is the emotion. Right? So you probably anticipated the evolutionary twist. Right? So Darwin is not just recycling Hartley's theory, he's offering an evolutionary analysis. So Hartley, an empiricist, claims that emotions are feelings that you have associated with actions, whereas Darwin claims that emotions are feelings that your ancestors have associated with actions. Right? So emotions, they're not just habits, they're heritable habits, they're inherited habits. And here's an example of Charles trying to merge Hartley's theory with his own theory of evolution. Does not Hartley's explanation apply perfectly to the origin of these instincts? The having received pleasure from some one person in early infancy during many generations giving love of mother, the having received some advantages from man during many generations giving the social feeling. So he's sort of trying to get at here is that he says, yes, a baby is born with an innate love for its mother. It didn't learn to love its mother. That was inherited. That is innate. But it has this because many generations of babies learn to love their mothers. Right? So it starts out learned, but then it becomes innate, it becomes instinct. Right? So again, we can give this sort of formula. If you take Hartley's theory of emotion and you mix it up with Charles's theory of evolution, you get Charles's theory of emotion. Right? Emotions are strings of inherited associations. Right? So I started with this question. Darwin has a theory of expression, but does he also have a theory of emotion? I've argued yes, right? I've sort of picked out these two quotes that I think really sum up the theory of emotion, right? He defines emotions as trains of thought, long associated with action, where I think long does a lot of work. He's talking about evolutionary time, right? Not right there. And he says that ideas and bodily actions make the emotion, they compose it. Right? So this leaves us with the idea that an emotion is a string of associated feelings and actions. So fear is the following. You see a dog, it reminds you of being bit. You vividly recall how much it hurt. You realize that you don't want to be bit again. And this train of associated feelings leads to associated actions. Your heart is racing, your hairs stand on end, your stomach drops. And we also have the claim that the feelings cause the expressions, but together they compose the emotion. So an emotion is a blurring of mind and body, right? That's the materialism. And so his book, Expression, is explaining how thoughts and actions become associated. That's the goal of it. But that's really an account of how emotions are made on his account, right? So expression is not just a theory of expression, it's also a robust theory of emotion. It's how this train of feelings and thoughts and anticipations and expressions occur. So that's the claim. I'll end with a kind of suggestion about how this sort of fits in with bigger ideas, right? So if you take intro psychology, you probably learn about these three classic theories of emotion. So this is kind of standard intro psychology. These are the three historical theories of emotion that paved the way for the contemporary psychological study of emotion. The first is philosopher William James, publishing just a decade after Charles's book is published. And although I can't sort of spell all this out, I think that there's much to be gained by adding Darwin's theory, or rather the Hartley-Darwin theory, into this mix, because this theory, unlike the others, has anticipated some interesting findings in psychology and really helps to explain how the research programs in psychology have developed. All right, thank you all for being here. Do you have any questions? Patrick?
Thank you for this. Later I want to have a conversation with you about Althusser's idea of interpolation.
Oh, yeah,
because
sure.
He tries to use the same way that ideology infects us through ritual, through actual bodily action. And having been raised Catholic, there's something about the Sid Stand meal that makes me find that compelling. But the question I have has to do with, you talked about trauma.
Yeah.
And it seems like the one thing that a train of ideas, a theory that, right, I understand trauma through the lens of like the unconscious or something, those sort of repressed experiences, whereas the way the train of ideas works, what's the relationship between consciousness and maybe emotional ambivalence or trauma, right? Because,
so trauma was my addition. They weren't talking about trauma per se. And, there wasn't any sort of account of like the unconscious. But you have this idea that because you have this, there was an age of sort of rapid developments of like neuroanatomy, so studying how nerves work. And so there was this idea that every thought we have involves some sort of physical modification to our brain, and so you have all these attempts to explain how ideas are sort of physically connected in the brain. But the idea is that as we experience the world, our brain is sort of constantly making connections, right? And so these connections mean that when energy passes through the brain, thinking one idea leads to thinking another idea because these like nodes are connected. And so it's not that we really know in the moment why our mind is sort of drifting the way that it is. We're just experiencing this sequence of thoughts which might make sense to us, or they might be really strange and mysterious to us. But there was some formative experience that made this connection, which we then sort of live with afterward, right? And so emotions actually don't play any sort of explanatory or causal role. It's just a result. So we see this rapid and reliable train of mental states, and we call it something like fear. But fear is not like an actual psychological process, which is a kind of result. Bill?
Yeah, I have a question timeline-wise. And when you were showing the chart, Darwin's various periods, you're rerunning?
Yeah, I'll go back.
And the question pertains to, when he actually took that, as you characterized it, something like an apparently Lamarckian move. When did he add that?
So all of his books include the idea that acquired characteristics can be inherited. And so, and we call it Lamarckian, but at the time he was living, everyone sort of thought that. So Erasmus Darwin also has a theory of the inheritance of acquired characteristics.
And his rival for the publication, Wallace, did too.
For sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it was with the modern synthesis, so combining sort of genetics with natural selection, that scientists sort of no longer believe that acquired traits could be inherited because they are not a part of our genetic makeup. But Origin of Species has a whole section on where variation comes from. And so he says variation just comes from the course of life, so the more we use an organ, the bigger it gets, and then we sort of pass that on. Right, and so there are experiments that suggest some kind of inheritance of acquired traits. It doesn't seem to drive evolution in the way that they thought, but the idea, which is kind of silly, is that if I get super buff and I sire a kid, that kid's going to be really buff, right? again, that's not exactly how it works, but for example, if you train a mouse to be afraid of a bell because every time it hears a bell you shock it, its offspring will be averse to the same bell, even though they've never experienced the shock. But that will extinguish after like 2 generations. So it's not sort of permanently inherited. It appears in 1 or 2 subsequent generations, but then it goes away. Dan?
I keep thinking about Freud, thinking about the subconscious and unconscious.
Yeah.
Trains are so like materialistic, as
Yeah.
such like material language, especially in the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah.
But in the space where associations are made, when those links are formed,
Yeah.
it does seem like there's a sort of subconscious thing happening there. Like you could use the language of the subconscious. And then when these trains are fully formed and then inherited and passed on, collectively, if individuals are all inheriting trains, it seems like there's like an unconscious there, like the big other. I just wondered, was there any engagement in Freudian psychoanalytic traditions at the later part of the 19th century with this sort of language, or are those 2 separate things?
I mean, I think of them as separate things. I mean, I could look into what sort of Freud and post-Freudians were saying about this stuff, but I'm just not. Rebecca?
Yeah, just curious. I mean, what you're saying about what his theory of emotion was seems pretty plausible. So I'm just wondering why all the people that you mentioned at the beginning think that he didn't have a theory of emotion. Like, why do they think that?
So I think, one way in which the view becomes sort of contentious is that it's denying that emotions are sort of fundamental parts of our minds, that they're rather just our ways of making sense of more basic experiences. So the associationist thought that really all the mind does is it senses the world, it stores copies of those sensations, and it makes associations between them. And so this was a reaction to sort of so-called faculty psychology. So you have a bunch of philosophers who say like, we have ideas, we have passions, we have the will. These are sort of parts of the mind. And so the associationists thought there are no parts of the mind. The mind does one thing and one thing over. It's like an association crank. And so in sort of modern parlance, this is what we call the constructionist view. So emotions only exist because we say they exist, because we put names on them, we make meaning out of them. But like a proper scientific theory is really just a theory of feelings and ideas, and then it's our conventions that sort of turn them into emotions. And so it's in a way very much opposed to modern Darwinian theories of emotion, which say like emotions are part of the architecture of our minds, like there are these affect programs that are guiding our experience. And so the idea is that emotions don't sort of impact our behavior in any way because they're just the kind of the outputs of our mind's processes. But I think so. In the published work, Expression, Charles does not lay out his theory of emotion, and so there's no part of that book where he's like, look, this is what an emotion is. He just talks about expression, and so that's why people say he didn't really have a theory of emotion. And so my sort of theory about it is that so Charles had gotten scooped. So he came up with his theory of emotion in 1838, 1839. But then in the 50s and 60s, these 2 other philosophers, Alexander Bain and Herbert Spencer, came up with the same theory and published a bunch of books about it. And so when Charles writes Expression, he very briefly refers to Bain and Spencer having discovered the true doctrine of emotion. And then he has this little footnote where he's like, well, actually, I was thinking about this stuff before them. But I think what happens is like he missed his chance to present this theory. Other people did it, and so he's just going to kind of focus on what he felt was sort of new and novel about his theory. I mentioned the first 2 principles of expression. The third one is just even more intimately connected with this particular theory of emotion. So that principle is only plausible on the assumption that I think he holds this theory that I'm crediting to him. So even though he's not laying it out, I think the kind of traces of it can be detected. Myrna?
Thank you. This was so much fun. I'm having a hard time putting all the pieces together of Darwin's theory. So I want to. I have 2 related questions. So the first one pertains to what inheritance, how inheritance works in this situation, because it seems like the mechanisms that account for emotions in the first place would still be, impacting your emotional development
Yeah.
later on. And so, and the related question is about, so is inheritance really the only thing he's thinking about, or is he interested in also explaining how different cultures have different expressions and emotional responses, or cross-species, different kinds of experiences? And so how else is his theory of evolution used to explain phenomena that he was witnessing in the animal and human world?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really great question. That's me leaving out part of the story. So what was new about his theory was the idea that associations can be inherited. But he actually held on to the idea that we can learn associations. So he thought that although emotions are pre-programmed to an extent, they're not fixed, they're not like hardwired, and so our experiences are constantly changing our emotions. And so the train of associations that we have includes both inherited associations but also learned ones. And he does in his notes, he kind of toys with the idea that the inherited ones are sort of good and proper for us and the learned ones are bad. So he talks a lot about the love of fame and money. He said these are acquired emotions that are sort of immorally bad. And so he does sort of try to make the case that if we evolved it, it's good, and if we learned it, it's bad. But he didn't quite work all those details out. But yeah, so inheritance and learning both form our emotions. Was that both questions, or?
I think so. I mean, one of the things, so yeah, because there will be some cultures, some places where love of money, what was your example, and aren't as prominent or something like that.
Yeah.
And so he's explaining how emotional attitudes towards certain things are different in different places in time. Is that the idea?
Yeah, and he does, I mean, this is again going into more detail, so he also has this theory of atavism, so the sort of return to primordial forms. And so he had this, I guess I don't want to go too in-depth into it, but he did think that if your parents have learned different forms of expression, so they've learned to express their emotions in different ways, when they make you will actually sort of revert to the original expressions rather than the learned differences. And so he thought that learned differences would be sort of eliminated. And so that's why, so he had this idea that, so throughout expression, he thinks that it's more important to look at expressions in children than adults because they're more like original or more natural, right? And that, sort of fits with this view that I'm saying, that there's a reversion to a primal form that erases the kind of inheritance of learning. Audrey, you had a question?
Yeah, so it seems like this train of thought is super linear. Did
Yeah.
they have any ideas that, like, because it seems involuntary, so is there any voluntary ways you can kind of switch the train of thought, or is it they strictly believe that it's all involuntary?
So, yeah, so I mean, I think, so it's all involuntary. It's sort of mechanical, so all these folks were kind of anti-free will. So we don't guide our thoughts are guided. And so kind of, if you know, kind of modern, empiricist philosophy, there's this idea that deliberation is just sort of competing desires sort of battling themselves out. And so we don't sort of control we are just witness to the stream of consciousness. We're not sort of controlling it, it's sort of happening to us, as it were. You also, I mean, the lineage, so these folks were really focused on the linearity of thoughts, and they had sort of reasons for that. They didn't really think about more complex structures where you have sort of branching streams of causality. And so it was a really kind of simplified version, so just A leads to B, leads to C, leads to D, right, without sort of any cool loop-de-loops involved. Good question. Zach.
So I'm trying to figure out how you get, and this begs the question, sort of complex emotions out of an ontology that seems to figure most prominently on pleasure and pain, right? So at one point you're sort of giving a constellation of emotions. It was hope and fear and grief. And this gives me fear, and the examples that they like to work with are examples of fear. But you can't sort of make sense of the complexity of our emotions if it's kind of reduced to that ontology. So I guess I'm wondering, like, two things. Qualitatively, what do they make of things like grief, hope, that are not going to be paradigmatic to their, to this way this project is going to try to reduce things? And then I'm just sort of curious, in expressions, it sounds like it surveys the behavior of non-human organisms too. Does he think that there's different capacities for humans that make us capable of those different sorts of emotions that we wouldn't see in, say,
Yeah, so in reverse order, so he thinks that there are sort of two expressions that are unique to humans, which are, one of them he calls weeping. He has a whole chapter on weeping, which he thinks is unique to humans, but also blushing. And his theory of blushing, which is not especially plausible, is that he thinks it's related to sort of self-consciousness, so it's sort of others seeing us.
Shame,
that way. Yeah. And so he thought that some emotions require intellectual capacities or processes that are unique to humans. And this kind of fits, so in the Descent of Man, he argues that human morality is sort of develops out of the social instincts, right? So he thinks that animals that live in groups have a sort of natural sense of sympathy and sort of fairness, sort of basic moral tendencies. But humans, because they have the ability to think about past and future, and because they have the ability to think about what others think about their actions, they develop sort of morality out of that. And so he does think that there are emotions that are unique to humans because they require self-consciousness in some sense. So looking back at the tradition, there was this whole sort of project of emotional chemistry. So you identify the elements, the emotional elements, so like fear and anger and joy are the elements, and then you figure out how they combine to form the compounds, which are the complex emotions, right? So nostalgia is something like sadness plus thinking about the past. And so the idea is that just this train of thoughts, if certain thoughts or feelings get inserted in that train, we sort of no longer categorize it as the simple emotion. Now we categorize it as the more complex emotion, right? So if the train of feelings that we would normally call anger includes the thought that you wronged Bill, then we would no longer just call it anger, we would call it indignation.
But the feeling would remain that initial feeling, just contextualized differently.
That's right.
These other, okay, thanks.
Addie?
To your knowledge, did Hartley or Erasmus or Charles ever touch on karma? Because with the string of actions and emotions, it just seems similar to the concept of karma, even though karma is more like the universe imposing on you, whereas the string of emotions is all inside of your head, but it's still like the same cause and effect. Did they ever touch on that?
Yeah, to my knowledge, they did not. That's a really good question. I mean, there was, especially in sort of Germany, really big interest in kind of Indian philosophy and karma. The talk was that good.
They're burning your house down.
Great question. Thank you all.